12th Annual Wheelwright Lecture and to introduce our speaker. The Annual Wheelwright Lecture is held to commemorate the pioneering role that Ted Wheelwright, as he was known, played in developing the field of political economy in Australia, and more specifically at the University of Sydney. The department is thriving and is not only a vital part of our school, but continues to set agendas in the discipline both nationally and internationally. As one might expect in this context, the Wheelwright Lecture has previously been delivered by pivotal figures in the field. This includes Diane Elson, Susan George, Leo Panitich, Eric Olin Wright, Kathy Gibson, and Alfredo Saar-Villay. And I'm delighted to say that our lecture tonight continues with this tradition of esteemed speakers. Our speaker is Susanne Soederberg, who is Professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Global Development Studies at the University of York in Canada. Susanne is one of the most innovative and incisive thinkers in political economy today. Her research interests include global political economy, global finance, the geopolitics of debt, corporate power, and the political economy of housing. Susanne, as many of you will know, is a prolific writer and researcher, and many of her books have helped define the fields of political economy and international political economy today. These books include The Wonderful Debt-Fair States and the Poverty Industry, Corporate Power and Ownership in Contemporary Capitalism, Global Governance in Question, and the Politics of the New International Financial Architecture. More recently, Susanne has been working on the linkages between low-income housing, finance, and social reproduction in urban centres, which includes a focus on the global scarcity of affordable housing for low-income earners. And I believe that she will be speaking to some of this research to us tonight. It gives me great pleasure then to invite Susanne to deliver the Wheelwright Lecture this evening, the title of which is Governing Spaces of Surplus and Survival in Urban Capitalism.
The topic, as you can see, is on displacements, and as Lisa mentioned, its connection to the lack of affordable housing in capitalism today, especially in urban spaces. And I think addressing you Sydneysiders living in a property market that is now the most expensive in the world, this should also be a topic very dear and near to your heart. And in fact, as I was formulating this talk, I tried to craft it in such a way that could allow us to have obviously insight into displacements in the various case studies that I'll talk about in a second, but also set it up in a way that we can also talk about what's going on in Sydney as well. I had a very insightful interview this morning with the tenants organization, New South Wales. So I'm a little bit up to speed in what's going on in Sydney, but I'm definitely not an expert. But what's lovely, not lovely, it's actually quite scary, is to see a lot of similarities between what's going on here and other urban spaces as well. So that said, I just want to go through. This is not working. Should we be testing this? The clicker's not working. That's okay. Are you sure? Okay. Well, no, I do want to. Okay, maybe. Yeah. If I do this, then. Yeah. No, I don't. You know, I have to. It's all free. Okay, I really want to walk around, but okay. So fine. The lecture has 3 components, just so you know. I want to spend the first component just quickly, conceptual clarifications, the key questions, an argument that I'm spinning around in terms of displacement, so that we have, we're all on the same page of where I'm going and the questions I'm asking and the puzzles that I have. The second part, we'll look at the 3 cases around which the talk sort of pivots, which is Dublin, Vienna, and Berlin. And the third, I'm going to do both, I'm going to walk and click, are looking at reflections, reflections on the case studies in such a way, again, I'm very interested in opening the discussion up for Q&A so that we can discuss what's going on as well in Sydney as well as in other places, but reflecting analytically, but also politically on what I've said so far today. Sorry, this talk might take a little bit longer than 45 minutes. So let's get to the framings. Here's a really interesting picture that also sums up displacement. And this is a family living in a hotel, emergency shelters, which is your daily sort of lived experience, if you will, of a lot of homeless families right now, homeless individuals in Europe, also in other parts of the world. I don't know, didn't get into the discussion, didn't get a sense that we have the same sort of situation here in Sydney in terms of hotels and hostels being emergency shelters, but it definitely is something that is very prevalent in Berlin and Dublin as well. So why am I looking at rental housing? Home ownership is definitely still a predominant tenure, right, in many parts of the world, but not all. In Vienna and Berlin, for example, the dominant tenure, 85% of the people live in rental tenure, regardless of their income. But the expansion of the rental tenure is quite interesting in places that used to be predominantly home ownership. According to the 2016 census, the New South Wales census, there was a shift or a decrease in home ownership in 2001 to 2014, I believe, from 68% to 63% in New South Wales as well. So there is this, and as you probably know, one of the key reasons for that is that people are getting locked out of buying a house, right? Because it's just simply too expensive. But we're seeing these sort of trends towards increased rental tenure in places that were predominantly, as I mentioned, home ownership tenure based. Dublin, for example, doubled its rental tenure between 2004 to present day, and it's growing continually. Right? So it is actually quite interesting. Just to note that tenure itself, whether rental or home ownership, is not natural. Right? It evolves and emerges through historical and geographical landscapes of the political economy of the place where these houses stand, right? So in 1956, the first census, I have lots of knowledge about Australia right now that I want to share with you. But it's very interesting for me. 1956, as you probably know, but I just want to make a point of this and show off my knowledge here, is that the dominant tenure in Sydney was home ownership, right? It was a little bit above 50%. And then the sort of push for the ownership society came in, which was a political strategy as well, right? As a class strategy, I would argue, right? So there's shifts and changes all the time in terms of rental and home, rental tenure and home ownership, right? That we have to keep in mind. These configurations are completely dynamic, and they take place within, obviously, a material and ideological and institutional setting. But the real reason why I'm looking at rental tenure is that's because that's the place where the urban poor live, right? And where they've always lived. And this is the place where they're also becoming increasingly displaced. So for me, at least, tonight, and in the context of my project, rental housing is important for that reason. So just to give you a visual of what's going on in the last couple of years, in terms of the three cases here, Germany, homelessness has increased by 150%. In Ireland, 145%. And in Austria, where we're talking about this model, social model that they have, which is this paragon of affordable housing, even in Vienna, it's rising. Now, just to highlight the fact that home statistics you have to take with a grain of salt, largely because governments refuse to engage in the collection of these numbers, which is problematic, and we'll revisit that in the third section of the talk as well. But it gives you a barometer of what's going on here. So, how is this explained? There's three broad narratives we'll go over. There's one which is occupies a lot of policy space, It's a very economistic sort of understanding, and that is, well, there's a dealing between supply and demand, right? And we read that every government will tell you that we just have to wait for the equilibrium to show up, right? And Jim Stanford, are you in the audience tonight? Jim has this lovely way of sort of discussing the economists waiting for the equilibrium as, well, the economist is their nirvana, right? Whenever it happens, it's just wonderful. So in order to achieve that nirvana, you couldn't possibly distort the markets by building social housing, right? You have to incentivize the private sector, and then the private rental sector will emerge and deliver this good, right? So we have to give them, free land or cheap land or leased land for a long period of time, tax incentives, grants, etc. And this will happen. So, we're still waiting for this, and waiting for it for several decades now, but I'm sure the nirvana will come at some point. But the point with that explanation is it's devoid of power, politics, history, geographical specificities. I think I'm preaching to the choir now, so I'll stop hanging on the economist. The second one also occupies space. It's trying to challenge the policy space. And it's trumped by people like Melanie Farah, the UN Rapporteur on housing rights, many social justice NGOs at various levels of resistance. And their argument is housing has become a financial asset, it has become a commodity, and we need to make it a human right. Love the sentiment, have complete problems with this argument. Looking from a Marxian point of view, housing has always been a commodity. It doesn't matter what tenure it is, it's always been a commodity. And it's been a very special commodity in capitalism, because not only is it a site of accumulation, but it's also a place of survival. And in Marxian terms, it's a site or a place of social reproduction, of labor power. And that's important to keep in mind. And that tension inside the commodity itself needs to be questioned, not confronted as a state. The third is the financialization debates, which I have great sympathy for. I don't want to get in, it's a huge religion. But here I'm basically taking aim at my colleague, whose work I respect, but find limits in, as all good academics have, relationships with each other. And this is Manuel Albers. I don't know if many of you know him. He's a big rock star in the political economy of housing. He's based in Belgium. And he's done excellent work on the financialization of rental housing, financialization of home ownership. And he basically tracks this rise of financial investors, right? These real estate investment trusts, all different types, private equity firms, right? These real estate moguls that come and buy up blocks of social housing, drive up the prices, right? And I have absolutely no qualms with that part of the argument. And what I do have a problem with, and he has a big following, so a lot of people that are now studying rental housing are always using Manuel's understanding of financialization, is that it really remains within the realm of consumption. And the questions that I'm asking, which is fine for the questions Manuel's asking, the questions I'm asking, and we'll get to them in a second, takes us beyond the realm of consumption to the sort of global dynamics or the wider dynamics of capital accumulation, right? That means there's exchange, but there's also production of goods and services. Because, hey, we still have production of goods and services. We're all wearing things that were produced, right? And as we'll get on, in these urban centers, a lot of tenants are working in low-wage service sector employment, right? So this is a very, very important aspect to keep it all together. The other thing was just looking at the realm of exchange is that class is taken out of the equation. When we look at tenant-landlord relationship, yes, it's a contractual monetary relationship, but in there is also a class relationship, right? Between, not necessarily capitalists, it becomes a little complicated as the story unfolds, but people that own an asset, own a building, right? These small landlords, if you will, but also the big corporate investors, and the landlord, right? And the tenant, who's also a worker, right? There's labor power there. So Manuel, for example, and others talk about financial capitalists, but they often forget about the people living inside the houses. They're not just tenants, they're workers, right? Or the classification within Marxism as labor power, right? So my sort of take from this and looking at these is, how do we start thinking about capitalism in a way that sort of satisfies the sort of understanding of displacement in a way that shows its dynamicism, shows its paradoxes, shows its class nature. And, I always kept coming back to this situation with Burberry. I don't know if you followed this a couple of years ago. They burned 28 million pounds of stock just to stop their goods from becoming devalued through counterfeiting. And for the gentleman in the room, the Burberry is a very high-end fashion label based in London. And what struck me with this was not only questions of obviously social and ecological issues, but the whole aspect of the surplus. There's surplus everywhere. We have surplus carbon. We have surplus capital. We have surplus goods, right? We have surplus money sloshing around. It's like $534 trillion of derivatives. I mean, what is $534 trillion? I can't even imagine it, but it's out there, backed by nothing, of course. Right? And with all of that, we also have surplus populations. We have surplus workers, right? They're not working enough. They're involuntary part-time. They're on contract work. They're not making enough to survive, right? So it's interesting. There's surplus that we can't deal with ecologically, socially, right? And there's scarcity. And there's a hell of a lot of scarcity, side by side. And Marx, if you were here, he would say, but that's a structural violence of capitalism. And I would say, absolutely. But it's come to a point of such insanity, such explicit insanity, and yet there's nothing. It just continues and continues. And as my story unfolds, you'll probably, hopefully, see the sentiment here in frustration. So I thought, well, again, this is nothing new. It's drawing on lots of different theorists, such as David Harvey. Why don't we look at contemporary capitalism and sort of situate displacement within contemporary capitalism marked by surplus capital? And here for a visual is, you've had Yanis Varoufakis address you, but he has this, I don't know if he talked about this at that time, but he has this lovely image of the twin peaks, right? Of the idle money on one peak and debt on the other, right? And that's it's very compelling. It's a nice image to have when I'm thinking about surplus capital. But what's missing from Varoufakis' understanding of surplus capital is also the people that are, I suppose, living in the valley and getting hit every time there's an avalanche from these peaks. And that is the surplus population, the workers, who were also tenants. Right? Workers, labor power, tenants. And they're connected. They're very much so connected. Because according to Marx, those twin peaks have created the social population, surplus population. They necessitate surplus population, he argued. My question is that true? Does capital need, the way the capital is structured today, the twin peaks, do they need all the surplus population that they're producing? And then the question of what gets produced within these houses, that the labor power gets produced, right, within these commodities called housing. To what extent is that called into question? The political commitment to ensure that social reproduction. The third prong, of course, because I'm a Marxist, so I have capital, labor, and then the state, is that the state plays a huge role in its configuration at all scales. So the European level scale, right, the EU, the institutions, the national scale, the urban scale. And it plays a large role in reproducing this reality of surplus and scarcity side by side, bringing them together. And they're brought together historically and geographically in specific ways in my studies, but they're brought together. And the state is the sort of key linchpin in bringing this all together. Here's a visual of surplus. After the 2007-2008 Dublin crisis, we have 30,000 homes, surplus homes. They're empty. This story plays itself everywhere. There's empty homes in Sydney too, I'm sure, as there's rising homeless. Surplus capital, surplus goods. And we have then people living in the valley. I really wish I had a clicker. We'd be done half an hour. Are these people, these folks, are surplus workers? This is grabbed headlines a couple of years ago. It's been a long time since the crisis, a couple of years ago. This is a family, a young family of boys, sleeping in the police station in Dublin. Why? Because they didn't have access to emergency shelters, i.e. hotels and hostels. 30,000 homes and scarcity. This is what I mean. How do we explain how this is reproduced and normalized and that we accept it? That, yes, we accept it. So from that, let's talk about what displacement is, just so we have something to look at. Just quickly, it's a removal from a place of security and stability. That can be physical, it could be an eviction, it could be complete emotional anxiety and stress over indebtedness. You're no longer in a place mentally and emotionally of security and stability. It can be visible and it can be invisible. Formal evictions, they're visible. There's a bailiff there. It's a big spectacle. But most of the evictions are invisible. They're informal evictions. The tenant gets an eviction notice and they flee out of fear or to ignorance in terms of their tenancy rights. They leave. Homelessness, visible, rough sleepers. Guess what, folks? Rough sleepers are like a little bit, a small number of what we know about homelessness. The majority, the 2/3 of homelessness that's going on is invisible. It's people sleeping on couches, in cars, hotels, emergency shelters. That's where they are. The people on the street, that's a minority of homelessness people. We have a whole new breed of homelessness going on under our noses, and we probably, a lot of you didn't know this. These are social constructs. This is not natural. So how do we get to the bottom and explain this? Displacements include cycles, processes of over-indebtedness, evictions, homelessness, over and over and over again. They're racial, they're classed, they're definitely gendered, of the displaced, of the surplus labor power. The people living scarcity, but yet are surplus at the same time. So what I'm trying to get across then today is that displacement is the outcome of the class-based facilitation and normalization of urban poverty and social marginalization on one side, and the accumulation of capital on the other, our surplus. And this runs through all the cases. So for the last slide of this section, I always tell my students that, so like, okay, we're almost done. Dublin I look at, because it's an interesting site, the rise of sort of rental tenure over the last several years, but it's also a poster child of liberal development. It was the Celtic Tiger. But guess what? It's the site of massive growth now. It's got the highest growth rate in the EU right now. It's back again. The Celtic Tiger is back again. And this is really fascinating to sort of look at displacement and ask those questions in that light. Vienna, the housing model, the social housing model everyone strives to well, I don't think the governments actually want to implement it, but everybody's writing about it. It's the model, it's everyone. If we could actually have the Vienna model here, it would solve all problems. So when I hear something like that, of course, I'm very cynical and go, really? Is it really a model? Let's look at this. So I'll show you some of the findings that I dug around in terms of Vienna as a housing model. And remember, 32% homeless. So it's not completely devoid of poverty and social exclusion either. And it has a very, very strong democratic welfare state. Berlin, the powerhouse, the capital, the powerhouse of the European Union, also known as the capital of homelessness in Germany. Again, this paradox of scarcity and surplus, very interesting. So that said, let's just turn to the first case and look at Dublin. We know that the Celtic Tiger years were spectacular, massive growth. We now know, in hindsight, that surplus capital was behind all that growth. It didn't really trickle down to the majority of people. And in fact, when I interviewed a housing activist in one of the social housing estates, she summed it up quite well when she said, we didn't see no Celtic Tiger. And it's not surprising, because although short-term unemployment decreased, long-term unemployment, part-time, temporary, and contract work, mainly filled by women, rose by 165% during the Celtic Tiger rise. Workers, even before the crash, started to rely on debt, especially lone mothers and Irish travelers. So we have this racialized and gendered dimension right here, and class, right here. And interesting, when you go into maybe the Q&A, is that they don't have payday lenders in Ireland. They have what's called door lenders. So you actually knock on the doors and lend money. They're regulated, apparently, but they're formal lenders. They're not part of the informal lending economy. And it's quite interesting, right? It's a quite different setup than it is in the UK. From 2008 to 2018, under the ambit of austerity, when it hit, because the party has to stop at some point, the Irish state cut spending on social housing. They went crazy, and they cut social housing by 72%. The death knell to social housing, public social housing. 2008, 2017, the wait lists for social housing increased rapidly. Of course, there's no social housing, but we'll get to that in a second, with upwards of 50,000 people residing in Dublin. That's 10% of the population are on the wait list. Do you know what it means that they're on the wait list? Most of them are homeless too. They're couch surfing, or they're about to get evicted. Or they're in massive, massive insecurity because of they can't pay for rent. Many on the wait list, again, welfare-dependent households with children, almost of which 2/3 are headed by women, who experience evictions due to rental arrears. So there you go. The already physically displaced are waiting for social housing. So how do we resolve this? Dublin City Council's main social housing channel is now the private rental sector, because the public housing is now obliterated, sold off to the market. But don't worry, because the markets are efficient, so this can work, right? It's not a problem. So what we'll do is we'll create rental assistance programs, and we'll also, at the same time, subsidize landlords. But let's you know, what's interesting about Dublin, and this today, I was really fascinated to learn this, that, you know, in Dublin, it's not all these sort of vulture funds. We had this conversation yesterday in the masterclass. It's not this sort of imagination of vulture funds with these huge corporate real estate investors, which is the case in Berlin and Vienna. In Dublin, around 70 to 80% are small landlords, amateur landlords, they call them, ma and pa landlords. In Sydney, it's 70% as well, which is interesting, right? So the state wanted them to subsidize these landlords in order to keep their mortgages afloat as well, right? So they thought that this was a good deal. We're supporting the market knows best, and we're subsidizing these mom and pop landlords. Okay, but here's the rub. I don't think they really thought this through. So they're rehousing people in the private rental sector where they were expulsed from in the first place. How does that work? And the fact that they're in these emergency shelters, if they actually can get in, for years. They're not in there for a week. We have families living right now in Dublin for years, 2 years, or they're in a hotel, and not just one hotel room. They have to move every time a tourist or a concert or it's high season or whatever. They have to get out of that hotel, go to another hotel. It's a really, they have no cooking facilities, right? It's a hotel room. I don't know if you've ever spent time with your family in a hotel room. Yeah? So, more anxiety, more stress in this type of situation. In 2018, Dublin City Council spent $118 million on shadow housing in 2018. And shadow housing was one of the policy people that I spoke to in Dublin City Council. That was his sort of shtick, shadow housing. I think that's a good descriptor of this, and we'll pick up more of this when we talk about disappearance in the last section. $118 million just in 1 year. They paid a little bit less the year before, a little bit less the year before that. But please don't build any social housing. I mean, the obvious solutions are just ignored. They're not. It's intention. Because they're not that dumb, are they? That they would spend all this money. That's one of the sort of scratching your head on evictions are super expensive for landlords. Housing or homelessness is super expensive for the state. There are ways to solve this problem that are efficient economically, but it's a political question. So let's travel to Vienna now, where we're going to visit the Vienna model. And Vienna, while Dublin was this really, really expensive, the most expensive city in Europe, Vienna is the most livable city in Europe, according to Mercer. And it is actually, in many ways, the most livable city in Europe, if you've got cash. So the housing model is rooted in Red Vienna, which was a very socialist, a big socialist experiment, if you will, from 1918 to 34, so right after World War I. And just something to keep in mind, because I have for some, is that people go on and on about Red Vienna, and I just thought, I have to go. So I wrote a chapter just on Red Vienna and the history of Red Vienna. And Red Vienna actually emerges because of specific material conditions, but also because there's a hell of a lot of political struggle demanding social housing for workers at this particular time. It wasn't the benevolence of the Viennese government. They were trying to stave off communism that was next door. It was just a perfect mix to then have this sort of particular model. And beyond that, their big commitment to social housing did not include the 60% of migrants residing in Vienna at that time from the Eastern Empire. They were not allowed into their social housing. Social housing was for skilled workers only, that were native Austrians. When I was practicing, I kept saying Australian, so if I mix it up, you will no doubt forgive me. So before we go on, it's interesting to sort of just highlight what this model is all about. We have 220,000 council flats owned by the city of Vienna. That's 25% of the housing stock. Beautiful buildings, wonderfully, meticulously kept, aesthetically, ecologically gorgeous. Who wouldn't want to live in these affordable housing units? The other component, though, however, is called limited profit housing associations. And they're like co-ops. You pay a particular down payment, right, which is some cash, to pay for finance, construction costs, and land. Other than that, you've got a secure, beautiful, and relatively inexpensive flat for as long as you want to stay in it. But there's exclusions, just as there were in Red Vienna, and just as there are everywhere and every time in capitalism. Non-native Austrians, for example, so the EU, Romania, the Serbs, and non-EU migrants, Turkey, and then more recently the refugees from Syria, were excluded from applying to these council flats till 2006. But history just repeats itself, right? The poorest of the poor, native Austrians, cannot get into these social housing. Why? Because they're means tested. You need to earn about, I think, 45,000 euro. That puts you up in the 80th percentile of income earners in Vienna. So a lot of people can't access these beautiful, lovely, affordable social housing. And the same constraints as with the limited profit housing associations. You need that big down payment. And a lot of people don't have that money. So who's living in these lovely social housing? The middle class and it's a contradiction, but the wealthier working class, if you will. Austria's entry into the European Union in 1995, which was pretty late for a country joining, coincided with the restructuring of rental housing. The federal government was always trying to get its hands on what was going on in Vienna, and this was a way for them to actually use the austerity, look, we're in the Eurozone now, et cetera, to go back to the Residential Tenancy Act and reconfigure some things. But the Viennese government was also very happy to play ball, and in fact, in 1996, they said, a year after joining, you know what, we're not going to build any more social housing. We're done. We'll stick with 220,000. Regardless if there's need, we're done. And together, I should say that it's still 60% of the rental housing in Vienna is comprised of the social housing and the limited profit housing associations. But the growth right now, if you're thinking of social housing after this time in Vienna, it's the limited profit housing associations, not the council flats. Oh, and I should mention that once you're in a council flat, you can actually, your kids could inherit the council flat as long as they've lived in the council flat with their parents for at least 10 years or something. So it could just go from generation to generation to generation. So I don't think a lot of people are leaving the council flats. Private rental sector at this point gets an overhaul. Make a long story short, they're actually able to adjust their rates northwards. With more freedom than prior to this time. So what does this mean for profiles of displacement of the people in there that are not part of the social housing scene, but are in the private rental sector, in the model of Vienna? Well, first of all, migrants are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than native Austrians. These are women and men. Migrant workers, however, and this is really interesting, comprise 44% of the population in Vienna. And in fact, last year, the 3rd most popular baby name was Mohammed. There's a huge demographic shift happening in Germany as well. 44%, completely underrepresented in social housing. Single mothers, low-skilled native Austrians not residing in social housing are also vulnerable to displacement, especially if they were looking for private rental sector housing after the big regulations went through in 1996. They're just super expensive. Number of people seeking debt counseling services increased over the new millennium to reflect these changes, but also labor market restructuring. And the majority of these debtors, as you're probably not surprised to learn, are migrants, Turks and Serbs. And in fact, when I was interviewing the state-led debt counseling service, they said, you know, every 7 years they land here in droves. And they said, you know, the refugees that came in 2015, 2016, they'll be here in 7 years as well. Because it's not sustainable. They're not earning enough money, low-wage service sector employment, underemployed, unemployed, remember our surplus population. They're relying on consumer credit and state welfare to make ends meet. but as rent keeps going up and up, it just becomes unsustainable at a particular point. Berlin, last case. What is this building? This is the Berlin Bankgesellschaft, also known as the BGB. And the BGB is interesting. I want to start my story here, the last case, because the BGB draws our attention to austerity before 2008. All these studies, and a lot of people that talk about homelessness and rental insecurity in Europe especially, are all about, well, it's after 2007, 2008, all this happened. Austerity was there all the time, right? The European Union, the entry into the Eurozone meant that you were trading, right, your fiscal and monetary independence for austerity and discipline at the regional level, right? You were trading your ability to be competitive in a social protection type of way with your labor markets by saying, no, we're going to engage in wage deflation because that's the only thing we can do to be competitive with our neighbors because we're all stuck in this monetary policy. So it is important to understand that all this restructuring that was going on, all this homelessness, displacement, has a story that probably starts in the 1990s, as with Vienna, as with Dublin. In Germany as well, 1990s, there's a lot of massive, did you know that, this is all this work, which is a savings and loans investment bank that serviced about 85% of Berliners after reunification. That's East and West Berliners had money in this bank. The bank started speculating, as they do, and ironically, in real estate, and it went kapow. Because of the type of legal structures in place in Germany at that time, again, these constraints of austerity, the federal government said, we're not bailing you out. Oh, by the way, the Berlin government had 56% shares in this bank, and it very much so depended on its income streams to pay for all the infrastructure projects it needed after reunification. So it wasn't a bind. The federal government was like, it's on you. You bail them out, you pay the cost. So they did, with massive ramifications. In fact, Der Spiegel, which is a weekly magazine in Germany, said at that time, this is the biggest banking crisis in post-war Germany. And the social implications of this will be felt for decades. One of the key things that happened as Berlin bailed them out, surplus capital out, was they decided they needed to raise some cash. At that time, Berlin had 19 municipal housing companies. So basically, there's social housing, which was protecting rent increases, etc. Their version of the Berlin model, if you will. They sold off 13 of them, lickety split, to big, these are the Albers, the financialization, these big real estate developers, right? These Deutsche Wohnen being one of the big ones, American investors as well. So they had 6 left. Of those 6, they said, listen, we can't just go on going on with the social housing and not turning a profit and acting like, this typical government laggard. We want you to adopt economic efficiency. We want you to marketize. In other words, we want you to engage in rent maximization. Again, the backdrop of the story, there's a lot of low-wage, low-income service sectors, like all these 3 urban spaces, massive deindustrialization going on in post-40s, et cetera, right? This was not good news for renters. Increased rental payments, coupled with precarious labor, resulted in a massive displacement. Their story in Germany in terms of the housing crisis begins around this time. Not after 2008. It just intensifies after 2008. High levels of over-indebtedness and rental arrears result in evictions and homelessness. Now, the job centers, the federal job centers, they can help stave off, technically, theoretically, an eviction. They can help materially give some funds to somebody that is in trouble. But the machine is so big, and the bureaucracy, imagine the German bureaucracy, so long and inefficient in many ways, that it really was not helpful. And there have been a lot of studies on this as well, in terms of the way things have been set up, that have just created, it's actually, there's no help system when it comes to evictions in Germany in this regard. Racialized migrants, Romas, Turks, Serbs, both women and men were overrepresented in cycles of displacement more than their German counterparts. And this was particularly true in stigmatized boroughs such as Neukölln, which had 43% migrants living there. Neukölln has, Germany has the highest homelessness rate. It also has the highest unemployment rate in Canada, or sorry, in Germany, not everywhere. And Neukölln has the highest unemployment rate within Berlin. And in fact, the finance minister, the former finance minister, referred to Neukölln as the slums of Berlin, which really, in many ways, drove home this sort of raced and raced space, if you will. So let's fast forward 2015. I'm conducting an interview in this building. I'm looking at this building going, this building looks familiar. Why does this building look familiar? And then I asked the person that's in there, sorry, I know if you don't read German, it's the Refugee Management Agency. Because in 2015, as we know, Germany received the highest amount of refugees in any other city in Europe. So this Refugee Management Agency is the same building as the VGB. I thought, that's a really cool connection. Here we have austerity and the surplus capital, managing surplus populations, and the impact of that then. And here we have in 2017 or 16, we have the same building, inheriting all that austerity, all that fallout, now managing a whole new wave of displaced people. This is going to be good, right? This is going to work. Yeah. They changed offices since then. Not because I pointed it out, but maybe, I don't know. In 2015, Berlin, just give you some numbers here, and you've got to love the German precision, right? Berlin received not 55,000, 55,001 refugee, okay? That tapered off to 16,000, oh, I thought I fixed that, 16,889, not 16,900. It was still the highest, even though that was quite a low number, it was still the highest in Europe. So what Berlin had to do now? Broke Berlin. In fact, one of the people I interviewed, I don't know if you know the slogan of Berlin, Wheelwright, the former mayor, very flamboyant mayor, used to say, well, Berlin is maybe poor, but we're sexy. And they said to me, Berlin's just poor now. Right? But they had to confront displacements. These refugees had to confront and navigate through displacement already. Huge amounts of displacement. For the refugees, we have three types of dwellings. We have emergency shelters, that hopefully rings a bell, the emergency shelters. We have communal accommodations, which is what they sound. Communal accommodations, several families share one small kitchen, living space, etc. And the third is rental housing. But let's be honest, not a lot of them get to number 3. And in fact, in the land of austerity, most of them have stayed for the longest time in number 1. This is what an emergency shelter looks like. And they played itself out in Tempelhofer Airport, where the largest one was in Germany, in Berlin. And it was just massive. I mean, imagine a hangar looking like that. And what's really interesting is these are public spaces, but most of the providers in there were private providers. And they didn't provide very well. This is a picture of a refugee with bed bugs. Aside from the physical, mental insecurity issues, especially around gender and the young children, this was terrible. These are terrible living conditions. You're like, okay, well, they got there and, they had to live there for a couple months and then they moved on, right? A couple of years, there's still emergency shelters. And in fact, in the unofficial home statistics of Berlin, these refugee shelters are included in homelessness statistics. And there's no official statistics, the NGOs that are collecting it. Then we can think of them as such. They're emergency shelters, just like that family that you saw earlier in the earlier slide living in a hotel. So then they said, you know what? We're going to build social housing. No. But why don't we build these tempo homes, which are probably better, temporary homes, better as forms of emergency shelters. And then what we could do, right, is that we could turn them into, we could move them everywhere, and students could live in them, and homeless people, German homeless people could live in these tempo homes. Look at them. I took these, I was banned from taking these pictures. I had to put my son in front of them, and he was all nervous. But these, it's 40 degrees Celsius. There's people living in there, right? As a security guard, there's a little girl on a bike. There's people living in there. There's life in there. It's super hot in the summer. It's super cold in the winter. I was talking to the Neukölln Welfare Office. This is in Neukölln. The big hangar is in the building right next door at the airport. This is on the runway, or the airport runway. This is a good place to put people. And they said, they're going and doing these constant checks there. There's kids that, the pipes, the heating pipes here, they get burnt all the time. There's no surveillance of the quality. But you know what? The private market built them, so they must be good, right? Spent a lot of money. One of the German people I interviewed at the refugee agency said, they built these things and they were just expensive and shit. But we've got new contractors coming in, so they may be better this time. That's your solution. It's a housing solution. Mayor of Leipzig, Thomas Fabian, you've probably heard of this quote, very famous quote. I don't like to use the term refugee crisis. We don't have a refugee crisis. We have a housing crisis. I share that sentiment up to a point. I've told you that things have been going on since the mid-1990s. Do we really have a housing crisis? How long does a crisis last? I mean, a midlife crisis only takes a couple of years. We go back to questioning, how is this normalized? And again, as I tell my students, this is the last part of the lecture. Depoliticizing and disappearing displacement. Let's think about that. Let's also add in, for fun, disciplining displacements. Let's decenter crisis. Let's move beyond crisis. I get that crisis draws attention to an emergency, but does it? Emergency shelters. Most people don't even know they exist. Right? I think at some point it becomes a trope, it becomes meaningless. This is a crisis. Again, it has its roots in the 1990s, folks. Even if we said it is after the great financial crisis, that's 10 years of crisis. We need to start making sense of this. This is not a crisis anymore. This is normalization. This is stabilization of urban poverty and social marginalization and capital accumulation on the other side. Crisis yields order and rationality in capitalism, Harvey argues. I agree. So let's try to figure out what that means. What is the order and rationality here that has reproduced this reality and keeps reproducing this reality? The surplus keeps growing, the scarcity keeps growing. I'm just going to throw it out here. We can talk about it. I'm not wedded to this. Modes of governance that we can think about here are normalization, and to normalize displacement could be the disciplining, depoliticizing, and disappearing of displacements, discursively, institutionally, materially. This does not happen without struggle. It happens with struggle. It happens in and through resistance. Resistance is everywhere. People are not just sitting back going, yeah, we're normalizing this. There's people fighting for, under the ambit of housing as a human right, whatever, but they're there and they're doing it. They're trying to give voice to the politically powerless, the surplus populations. And some of them aren't even surplus populations. right? I think this is important to sort of keep in mind, and it becomes even more problematic because of this. And people are mobilized at the local level, at the national level, at the EU level. They're fighting every day for this. They're not budging at all. They're not budging the scale at all. And so maybe we'll think about some of the depoliticization that's going on in terms of the discourse. And I think discourse is very, very important here. And this quote, and it plays itself over and over again, as do good tropes, right? But this is one representative of the tropes that keep playing themselves over these dreamy urban spaces, and I'm sure you'll see this in Sydney too. Housing crisis is completely normal. Every country in Europe has equivalent issues in terms of affordability, in terms of homelessness. So why bother? It's just normal. Let's just roll with it. And in a way, this guy's kind of right. It's become normal. Let's look at some disappearances in Dublin. Hubs, family hubs. Remember we talked about hotels and hostels and how those kids were sleeping on the benches in the Guardia and the police station in Dublin? Well, they're like, you know what? Instead of building more social housing, because that would not be good, why don't we build more emergency shelters and call them hubs? We'll call them family hubs, and we'll put families in there. So they built 22 family hubs. They're like workhouses. They're incredible, these poor houses. They're run by these overzealous welfare workers, social workers. They're policing every move of the largely single mothers that are in there with their children. There was a huge report released a couple of months ago, and the headline grabbing moment of this report was these kids that are running away from the hubs. They don't want to go into the hubs. They're sick of seeing their mothers being castigated in front of them, being told when to go to bed, what programs to watch. Everything is micromanaged because we have to turn the undeserving poor into the deserving poor, don't we? I think we're back in time, not forward. Also, these hubs, I should say, are built in hotels. They're refurbished hotels. They're run by the city, Dublin City Council, but a lot of them are run by, you guessed it, for-profit organizations. Because we have a market opportunity, ladies and gentlemen. And so the other disappearance, and discipline as well, I suppose, and hubs definitely are a space of discipline, of the displaced, are these HAPs, Housing Assistance Programs. Remember those 50,000 people on the wait list? Dublin City Council said, you know, we're not going to build more social housing, but we're going to resolve this through the private rental sector. They just need some help. We just incentivize the private rental sector. So we're going to create the Housing Assistance Program. So unlike the Rental Assistance Program, where Dublin City Council actually helped find some rental spaces in the private rental sector for the people on the wait list, the HAPs mean that you are responsible for going out and finding your own private rental home. You get some money allocated to you. That money is never enough to pay for the rent. It's always less than the rent. You're already stigmatized. You're going out and you go, hi, I've got a HAP. Do you want to rent to me? No, right? I've been evicted, by the way. Yeah, it's okay. You can trust me. I've got government assistance. I'm good. It's not going to work, right? So, but what the catch here is the government says, Dublin City Council says, you can get a HAP, but you have to get off the wait list. Guess what? Waitlist numbers went down. That was tricky, wasn't it? Right? But it's, again, it's you know, we've had the disciplining the poor, the undeserving poor, making them deserving, and here we have responsibilization, individualization. No, you take care of your own. We'll help you, but you find your place. You make sure you make your payments because, you know, you need to get disciplined. So the reason why you left is because you weren't timely with your payments, not working hard enough. Okay, depoliticization in Berlin. Massive collection. You've probably read Berlin in the news. They've introduced rent freezes for 5 years, taking effect January 1st, 2020. It's been very controversially greeted by many people, and we'll talk to these people here. We'll talk about them in a second. you know, in theory, it sounds great, right? Rent freezes for 5 years. But, you know, we had that in 2015. They put a 10% rent freeze on. In 2017, Berlin registered the highest rental increase in the world. It didn't work. There's too many loopholes, renovations, new buildings, all kinds of loopholes that landlords can get away with. So in sentiment, absolutely, why not? It's better than anything, nothing, right? It's better than kicking the teeth. A rent freeze, great. More importantly, what's developed in this picture, these people, the Deutsche Wohnen side, has just been a big referendum to nationalize these huge German housing companies. Deutsche Wohnen used to be a public, municipal, soft up, privatized municipal housing company, and privatized other municipal housing companies, because it's huge. It's the biggest landlord in Berlin. And they said their proposal is, and the Berlin government is very much in favor of this, they said, you know, if you own, Jedi and everything, but it's a crazy amount. It's something like, if you own more than, 100,000 apartments, you are getting nationalized. Taking you back. Sounds great. There's a lot of red tape. It could be in courts for years, but it's a fantastic show of collective solidarity against these hugely powerful actors. But there's limits to it. And largely because of this whole financialization remaining in the realm of exchange. It's a good start, but there's more that needs to be done. And we're not saying that these collectives, these organizations are not talking about this. But, you know, you can't just focus on temporary rent caps. They don't work largely, right? And, you know, the whole idea of nationalizing Deutsche Wohnen is a great idea, as long as you go back and say, we cannot marketize those municipal housing companies. You can't just nationalize something and allow it to do the same type of behavior, rent-seeking behavior as the other municipal housing companies. And in fact, here's an interesting point, that some of the social municipal housing companies in Berlin were charging higher rents than Deutsche Wohnen. Right? So good, nationalize it, but then change the structure of these the municipal housing companies. And more importantly, let's take it one step further and change the residential tenancy law. Let's make sure that people have living wages. Let's make sure that people are not engaged in involuntary part-time work. Let's go a little further than that, because we have surplus. We can do this. There's $500 trillion of just derivatives sloshing around. Can't we just access a bit of that? It's a political question. It feeds into the normalization. If they actually publish these things, oh my God. If you guys knew how many people were being evicted every day in Sydney and how many people were made homeless, not rough sleepers, the actual big numbers of homeless people in Sydney, would people just sit back and just take that? I don't think so. Shadow nature of emergency shelters, from refugees to homeless. I guess they're the same anyways, right? They're shadow housing for a reason. We don't see it. They're not right. We have absolutely no oversight of these places, largely because they're hotels and hostels, people, hubs. This is where people live for years. These are their homes. It turns our gaze away from questions regarding the high cost of emergency shelters and evictions over other alternatives. That's the point I sort of raised again earlier, right? I mean, this whole sort of idea, if you actually ran numbers, and this came, people in Dublin were saying this, people in Berlin, even the municipal housing companies, they're like, we want to evict people. It's a pain in the ass. It costs so much money at the end of the day, right? There's a lot of back and forth for the ones that actually want to fight it. A few, but there's other alternatives that we can pursue here than evicting people. But no one talks about it. I've taken this cue from the University of Sydney, because I love that, the unlearning. I love it. So we could unlearn crisis. That's brilliant, by the way. I love that. Unlearn crisis. Need to identify and prioritize the structural violence the invisible structural balance, the scarcity and surplus we opened up with. Why is that there? Why is that there? Perhaps we can understand that, but why is that continually being reproduced and at such intense levels every year? It has not gone down. Problematized class, racial, gender features of displacement. Super, super important. They're huge dimensions of the story. And make visible, more importantly, the disappearances and repoliticize the depoliticized. I think these are good places to start, and unlearning the crisis and stop talking about it as just a crisis and take ownership of the fact that it's something that has been produced and reproduced by everyone for the last several decades, whether through benign neglect or intentional. It's something that we all have to, anyone that cares about social justice has to think long and hard about. And that's it, folks. Thank you very much for listening.